Today's daf is daf ches, and just to fill in what was missing here from yesterday's shir on daf zayin amid beis, in terms of the machlokes between Rebbe and the Chachamim with regard to the korban tzibur of avodas kolchavim, which is a par for ola and a soya lechatos. Rebbe holds that with regard to the Mashiach, the Kohen Mashiach, in the case of Avodah Zarah, he's chayav that unique combination of a paraliol and soil lechatos for shigas maseh, whereas the Chacham hold that no, he's chayav the Mashiach for helim dover. They both, Rebbe and Chacham, agree that a Mashiach does not bring an Osham Tolui, and as far as the Seira, they both agree that the Kohen Mashiach has the status of a Yachid with regard to the Seira. So the Gemara here in the last two lines on Zayin Amid Beis, the Shavin Shebeseira Ki Yachid, the Gemara says Minolan. The Yomar Kra, the Nefesh Achas. Echad Yachid, Echad Nasi, Echad Mashiach. Kulam Bechlal Nefesh Achas. So the Nefesh Achas teaches me that all these three, whether it is the Yachid, whether it's the Nasi, whether it's Mashiach, they're all included on the Nefesh Achas. And therefore they're included under this category of Seira Kiyachid. And now we start our daf for today, daf ches. Now this daf is mostly drashos, derivations. And again, there are a lot of details about how and when you derive things. There are all sorts of extra words, extra letters, extra xerashavas, and so forth. We'll learn the Gemara just on a superficial level, which is appropriate for Daf Yomi. So Vishavin, both Rebbe and the Chacham agree that Ein Mevi Osham Tolui, that a Kohen Moshiach does not bring an Osham Tolui in a case where he doesn't know whether he violated these or didn't violate some. How do we know this? The Chsiv, V'chiper olav hakohen al shigigoso asher shogag. And we're going to derive the conclusion from the pasuk al shigigoso asher shogag, that we're talking about not the possibility of a korban that he brings on shigaga. The pasuk doesn't talk about some sort of suffix asham, which would be an asham tolui, but seems to be formulated in the definite shigagas asher chata. Now the pasuk seems to imply that when is an asham tolui brought, it is brought by someone who would incur a chiyuv chatas through a classic shkaga, not someone who only is chayiv, only incurs a chiyuv chatos for helem davar, for a mistake in the matter of halacha, of a hora betos. Rebbe necessarily says that, however, says that a Kohen Moshiach will be chayiv a chatos in the case of avodah zarah, even though it was just a shigas maisa. There was no helim dover as far as the halacha is concerned. So when we read this pasuk al shigas asher chata, we come to the conclusion that the Kohen Mashiach would in fact bring an asham talui in the case of a suffix, whether he violated avodah zarah. But Rebbe Savar, he wants to reinterpret the pasuk as Misha kol cheto b'shkaga, And he, so to speak, adds the word kol. The Gemara is going to try to figure out how Rebbe adds the word kol, but it's kol shecheto bishkaga. We have to find someone who is chayav achatas for all his shkagos, yotze zeh, to the exclusion of a kohen mashuch melchama she'ein kol chato bishkaga, because basically, in terms of the chiyuv shkaga of a kohen mashiach, it's not a classic shkaga through through forgetting himself or not realizing that this is chatos, but rather through helem dover, right? He has to have deviated in his understanding of the law, deviates from the real true law, and therefore, says Rebbe, even in the case of Avodah Zarah, where all he needs is shigas ma'isa in order to be chayv chatos, he's not going to bring a carbon asham tolui. So the Gemara immediately asks, Midei kol ksiv? How did Rebbe jump the gun here and add the word kol to the pasuk? Nichtov al shigagasa lomali asher shagag. So the language asher shagag would have been more appropriate than al shigagaso. Therefore, hakamashbalon di adeika kol cheto b'shkago. So the language of al shigigaso indicates, going to Rebbe, kol cheto b'shkago. And that excludes the Kohen Mashiach, who, as we said before, he's chayiv for helim dover. Yotza Mashiach she'ein kol cheto b'shkago levos kol chav lo b'shar mitzvus el behelim dover im shigas ma'aser. B'Rabbanon, how do the Rabbanon interpret this pasuk of the Chipra of a coin al shigigos shagag mi shecheto bishkaga, who is chayiv an asham toli? Only someone who would be chayiv for shigas ma'aser a chatos yotza mashiach b'chav shein cheto bishkaga lo b'avodos kol v'lo b'shar mitzvos el behelim dover shigas ma'aser. Because as we said before, the Chachamim are of the opinion that even in the case of Avodas Kol Chavim, the Kohen Mashiach Melchama is only chayav in a case where he violates through Helem Dova. Now we started the Mishnah. Ein bezdin chayovim ad sheyor b'dover shezdonu kos shigoso chatos. When do we bring a par helim dover shel tzibur? That's in a case where, if it would have been amazing, it would have been kares. If it would have been shkaga, it would be chatos. V'chein Mashiach, the same applies to the Kohen Mashiach. V'lo b'avodos kol chavim. They're not chayev in the case of avodos kol chavim ad sheyoru dover al sheyoru dover shezdonu kos shigoso chatos. Minolan, how do we know this? The Sanya we learned in the Raisa Rebbe Omer. Nemar kan oleho v'nemar lahalan oleho. So in the parsha of Yibum, with regard to in the parsha of Horiyos, with regard to one's wife's sister, the Torah says oleho, and here also in the parsha of Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur says Oleh, for that's Xer Shav Malahal, just like in the case of Achos Ishto Dover Shes Dono Kares. If he would have a relationship with his sister-in-law, b'meisid he be chayv kares, and if he did it b'shogeg, he brings a chatas afkan. Here too, in the Helim Dover Shel Tzibur, also it says Oleh Dover Shes Dono Kares Shigoso Chatos. So, for example, we spoke at great length about Chalev. Chalev fits the bill. But let's say it would have been a regular Isur of, let's say, Nevela or Treifa or Orla, where there's no Chiv Kares, then the Helim Dover Shel Tzibur would not be brought by the Halom of the Bezdin. Ashkechan Tzibur Moshiach Minol. And how do you know that again? In the case of Kohen Mashiach Milchama, then he's chayiv to bring a carbon chatos, and the answer is la ashmas ha'am. So what is ha'am referring to? It's referring to Mashiach Kitzibur, because in the parsha of Kohen Mashiach it says ha'am, and ha'am makes an equation between the Kohen Mashiach and the Tzibur, which teaches us that just like in the case of a shogeg of the Am, and they violated an Isur Kares, then the Chayv Chata, so too in the case of a Kohen Mashuach, he's only Chayv Chatas if he violates a Chiyuv Kares. Nasi, how do we know that Nasi brings a Chatas if he violates an Avera which would generate Kares B'mezid? Yolif, mitzvos, he has another Gzeir Shava from mitzvahs and mitzvahs. Ksiv gabi Nasi v'asa achas mikol mitzvah Hashem. So we're going to emphasize the word mitzvos. Uksiv b'tzibur, with regard to the chiyuv of the tzibur, it says v'asu achas mikol mitzvah. Again, the word mitzvos. Ma tzibur davar she'ezdono kares shegasa chatas af nasi davar she'ezdono kares shegasa chatas yochid. How do we know that a regular person who violates a chiyuv avera and he has to bring a chatas, it's only if it was an avera on the level of kares, or my kravim nefesh. Now, this pasuk appears, it's called the Tachton, immediately after the pasuk that begins before it with the Nasi, and the first pasuk and the second pasuk are connected by a Vav Hamachaber. And what does that Vav allow me to do? It's Yilmo Tachton Mi Elyon. There's an equation between the one that comes later and the one that came before it. And just as in the passage that comes afterwards, the passage that is the Elyon, because that's going to be Melamed, that's the Nasi. So he's Chayv Achatas because he violated a Chiyav Avera which b'mezu b'bekares. So too, every individual, and that's considered the Elyon. I'm sorry, the Tachton, which came afterwards. The pasuk also is only for a Chiyav Kares. V'lo b'avodas kol chamad sheyoru. In the case where they have to bring a special carbon for violating Avodah Zarah, b'shogeg, that only applies when there was a permissive psak hora in a matter of Avodah Zarah. And again, if it would have been that kind of violation of Avodah Zarah, which would generate the mezid kares, therefore, if they did it unintentionally, they have to bring a chatos. Avodas kochavim minolan. Well, how do you know that in avodas kochavim the tzibur will only bring a carbon, that unique carbon of a tzibur that violates avodah zarah with a paraliola and a sorah lechatos, if there was some sort of error made in psak halacha, and what the tzibur did was they violated an avera for which b'meza they would have gotten kares. The Tan Rabbanan, the answer is lefi sheyotza avodas kochavim ladun bi'atzma, so that when it comes to the special carbon of avodah zarah for the community, it's not included in the parsha in Vayikra, Perek Dalet, with regard to Helim Davar Tzitzi, but rather it was addressed as a separate parsha in Bamidbar Perek Tes Vav, and there's no mention there of kares. Yachol yu chayav mafil al davar she'ein zdono Kares Shigaso Chatos. Never kan me ene. Now we have to introduce another Gzeir Shava. Never lahalan me ene. So in the case of Helim Dover Shel Tzibur, it says me ene, and in the case of Avodah Zarah, when there was a tzibur that violated Avodah Zarah b'shogeg, it says me ene ma lahal, just as in the case of Par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur Dover Shel Kores Shigaso Chatos is Afkan Dover Shel Dono Kores Shigaso Chatos. So to here, with regard to Avodah Zarah, it's only an Avodah Zarah Isur which would generate Kores. Ashkechan Tzibur Yochid Nasi Mashiach Minolan. How do we know that in all these cases of the individual, the Nasi, the Kol Mashiach, they're Chayav Achatos for Avodah Zarah only if the Isra Avodah Zarah was at the level of a Kares, Hamakrovim Nefesh Achas. Echad Yochid, Echad Nasi, Echad Mashiach. Kulam Bichlal Nefesh Achasein. V'yilma Tachto Mina Elyon. And now we can derive the intention of the later pasuk from the former pasuk, and just as the tzibur will incur a special carbon for violating Avodah Zarah bit shogeg because it was a chiyuv kares, so too all these individuals, whether it's a yachid or a nasi or a kohen Mashiach, will incur a carbon for violating Avodah Zarah bit shogeg, but only because the Isa Avodah Zarah was on the level of a kares, and certainly Mises Bez. Now, we had a Gzeir Shava from Achos Ishto called Oleha Oleha. And that taught me, and we derived the case of a par Helim Dover Shel Tzibur. So the Gemara says, fine. Rebbe uses that Gzeir Shava, and he's covered. But the Rabbanan Shita in Masechta Avodah Zarah, at the beginning of the Masechta, is that from Oleh we derive the conclusion that we have what's called Tsaras Erva. And a tzara to an erva is also excluded from Yibum. Dover says dono kares b'shigaso chatos minolan. Minolahu. Nafkale minamaisi le Rabbi Yishuv ben Levi lebret. Torah achas yelachem li osa b'shgaga. And the Torah refers to someone who violated any law of the Torah, and he did so b'shogeg, v'nefesh tas v'yad rama, but if he did it b'mezid, then the Torah goes on to specify exactly what his punishment is. So now we're going to connect these two psukim. In one pasuk, we're dealing with a chatos and a shogeg, and the Torah is creating a hekesh between Avodah Zarah and other laws of the Torah that were violated. Hukshakal Torah kula avos kacham avos kachavim shechayavin al zdono kares val shegaso chatos. Afkan, with regard to all the laws of the Torah, if you violate them b'shogeg and you chayv chatos, that's only chayav al zdono kares val shegaso chatos. Ashkechan yochid nasi u'mashuach minolan bein bi'avodas Kippurim, Avodas Kolchavim Slicha, Bein B'Shar Mitzvos, Tzibur Minol. And how do we know that we need an Avera on the level of a Chiv Karis B'Mezid, Yolif Elyon Mitachton? The Gemara asks for Rebbe, who derives that a Chatos is incurred for a Karis level violation for the Gzeir Shava of Oleha, Had Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi Ma'ov. He doesn't need this derivation of Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi from the pasuk Asher Tasa B'Yad Rama Torah achas yeh lachem lo b'shkaga. Mafikli l'sanya, Rebbe used it for a different derivation. L'fisha matzinu shechalak hakosu ben rabim liyochid. Right, there's two fundamental differences between the Rabbim and the Yachid with regard to violating Avodah Zarah b'mezid. Rabbim, when we're talking about Irani Dachas, B'Sayev, Umamonim Ovad, they're put to death with the sword and all their possessions have to be destroyed. However, by contrast, Yechidim, if it wasn't an entire city, but rather individuals who violated Avodah Zarah, is Beskila instead of Saif, it's Skila, which, by the way, is probably more Chamor than Saif. And that's because he's working on his own. You know, if he works together with a city that was influenced, that's something else. Mamon and Polat. But on the other hand, the Torah, although it was Machmir on an individual requiring of him skila, but nevertheless, with regard to Mammon, there was no halacha because that's halacha in the ear, is Yachol Nachlok B'Korban Oseyim. I might say that in the light of this fundamental distinction between the Tzibur and the Yochid, I might apply that logic and come to the conclusion that there are different karbanos for the different violations. Talmud Lomer Torah achas yelochem. Maskif lo Rav Chilkiah me'agunia. Taima de lo cholak hakosuv. The Bryce is telling me that the reason why we're going to equate these karbanos is because lo chilek hakosuv ha chilek havamina nachlok. The implication of the Bryce is that if the Torah would have had some sort of a distinction, we would have said, okay, if there's a distinction here, then maybe we should bring different karbonos, my maisi. But in the Havamina, what different karbonos could you possibly bring? Naisi par. If you're telling me that for the violation of Avodah Zarah, they're going to bring a par, well, tzibur b'shar mitzvahs hu demaisi. We say that the par is brought for the violation of other mitzvahs with the exclusion of idolatry. Nesi par liola v'sar lechatos, which we said is the unique carbon tzibur for violating Avodah Zarah, is tzibur b'avodas kolchamu demaisi. That's a special carbon that we don't find anything similar to it, and it is designated and limited to avodas kolchavim of the tzibur. Nesei soyer. So maybe we should bring a soyer. Just give me a second here. What's Nesei b'soyer? I'm not exactly sure how the Gemara has a habmin of Nesei b'soyer. I mean, we said the Saras Lachatas, but he also needs a paraliola. The Tzibur needs a paraliola. Anyway, let's just see a little weiter. Nasi b'shar mitzvahs hu demaisi. So apparently, only the Nasi, if he violates other mitzvahs out of the Torah, there's a unique carbon that he has to bring for that shogeg, and that is Sa'ir. But we don't find Sa'ir in any other situation. However, Naisi Se'ira, maybe they could bring a Se'ira, is Yachid Nami Hainu Karbana. If a Yachid violates Avodah Zarah b'shogeg, then he brings a Se'ira. So the Tzibur brings a Sa'ir plus a Par, and the Yachid brings a Se'ira. So there doesn't seem to be any room for a special carbon in a case of a tzibur in Avodah Zarah. So why do we need the pasuk Torah achas yelochem? Itzur salke daitechamina. I would have considered the following possibility. that Tzibur Maisi Parli Ola Visar Lechatos Hani, but in the case of Naisi Ibcha, maybe in the case where the entire community violated Avodah Zarah B'Shogeg based on the mistaken Tos Hara of the Sanhedrin, they should also bring the exact opposite. Par lechatos v'soy liola. How do you know it's par liola and soy lechatos? Maybe it's par lechatos soy liola. Inami tzorach v'ein lo takana. Or maybe we should come to the conclusion that the tzibur has to bring a special carbon, but we don't know what that carbon is, and therefore maybe there's no atonement, no remedy at all. Kamashmal there, the Torah has to say, Torah achas yelachem, that if the tzibur violates avodah zarah v'shogeg, every single member of the tzibur has to bring a classic, standard chatos kvua of an individual idolater. The kuli alamios, everybody seems to agree that ki ksive hani kroi. What are these psukim in Bamidbar referring to avodas korban ksumai mashma? How do you know that these psukim that we're darshaning here from Vayikra and from Bamidbar, how do you know that they're referring to avodah zarah? Amar Ravi Tamer B'Shuben Levi Amar Lekidi Amar Kra V'Chitishku V'Lo Tasu is called a misay. Apparently, there's some shgaga on a violation that's equal to kol mitzvahs. Ezi mitzvah shishkula kiregi kol mitzvahs havi omer zu avodas kochav. So it must be referring to avodas kochav. That's the first answer. Second answer, debei Rabbi Tana Amar Krasha Divrashem El Moshe Uksit. And we have another pasuk that has similar words. Asher tziva Hashem Aleichem biyad Moshe, and that's referring to the Aseres Adibros. Is the first pasuk indicates that Klal Yisrael heard Hashem speaking when Hashem gave the command to Moshe. The second verse implies that it was commanded to them through Moshe. They didn't hear it, they didn't hear directly from Hashem. So we're dealing here with a mitzvah that was issued twice, once directly by the word of Hashem, and a second time through Moshe. Ezi mitzvah shehi b'dibur shal HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which mitzvah could have been given us directly from the mouth of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, so to speak, v'tziva al yidei Moshe. Hevi omer zu avodas kochav. V'tan Rabbi Shmuel, anochi v'lo yelecha mipi ha'gvura shamum. So when it says that tziva al yidei Moshe, it's referring to avodah zarah. Because Anochi v'lo yelecha, the first two commandments, were given directly from Hashem. And when Hashem revealed himself at Har Sinai and the Jews heard the first two dibros directly from Hashem, they were overwhelmed. They couldn't listen more directly from Hashem, and therefore Moshe Rabbeinu was the one who would be the go-between, so to speak. To Bei Rabbi Shmuel Tan is a third answer to that question.